Hi class, welcome to my home classroom, Zumba studio, all those things now. I'm here to get you started on your post-COVID Unit 1 on language and style. This is from chapter 12 in your Speak Up text, and I have outlined some PowerPoints that are available in this unit, but I want to just give you a little bit and tell you a little bit about what's coming up. Just a few announcements. Pretend that you're still going to campus. What would be going on campus right now is that we are having a student election, and you should have an email about that. You might recall that one of the people came and asked you to sign his petition to run, but that election is going through April 8th. So you might want to check that out. Please check your emails. That is how I am communicating with you. That's how most of your instructors are going to communicate with you. There will be important information there about deadlines, refunds, all kinds of things. When textbooks are going to be due, all of that information you will be getting from email. So don't be that student who just doesn't check in. Thank you to those of you who signed up early to give your speeches. The rest of you will be doing that this week. So we're going to start with the language unit, and I don't think there's anything in this crisis that we've had that hasn't shown us the power of choosing words. And you will probably recall Ogden Richards' triangle of meaning. If I had a whiteboard, I'd be doing this, but I think this is a review. So there is a triangle that models how words are attached to their labels. And so when you think about the word as not being the thing, that's why this is a dotted line. This is only an implied relationship. So we could very easily change out the word and attach a different word to a thing, like you've done with the word bet or fire, and have meaning. Dropped was one that my son used today that he's like, yeah, I'm not using it like you think I'm using it. So words and things are no longer attached necessarily when the thoughts change. You can change the thought and the label can mean something new. And we call those connotations. So remember, the first time at the podium that you use a word, you should be defining it. If it's something that you think that you're using a little bit differently or that the audience is not familiar with. Even if there's a few people in the audience that don't know what it means, it's worth the time investment of your 5 to 7 minutes, or in the next speech, your 7 to 10 minutes, to define it upon first use. So especially if you're going to use a different definition. Let's say that you're going to operationalize a term like modern. So modern, if you look it up, might mean something different than this, but you could say that I'm going to be using the word modern to mean anything that has happened since 2010. So that gives a context for your audience. So let's just buzz through some of the PowerPoints. You're going to have a little bit more information, but we know that there is a difference between the way you talk and the way you write. We write way more formally. You've been told never to use you, and I'm going to tell you in persuasion, it's important to use the word you. It is important to draw people in. It is important to say our country. We are in this together. I bet you've heard that a lot. And I think about the challenge that it has been to be a leader in this crisis situation. Because think about trying to use the podium to inspire hope, yet be transparent about what's actually happening in the country today. How do you do that without saying things like a beautiful timeline of getting this behind us by Easter and then having to recant that later? So I understand the challenge of having to deliver information about this incredibly moving target and to have something that's close to reality that's probably going to change tomorrow. So I think that is a challenge, and I'm trying to be generous in my observations and my critique of people who are in leadership positions now, because I think it is a very challenging time to be a leader. So we know that when you are speaking, you're way more adaptive about changing course, about drawing people in who are in the here and now. We know that written word is way more static, and it doesn't really take into consideration the reader. But when you're speaking, you're very much supposed to be, it's all about audience analysis and pulling in and using examples that relate to the particular audience. Also, we are way more repetitive in spoken word, and we're expected to. No one has a written guide except the teacher who has your outline. And a lot of times I'm just listening and trying to keep up and grade and not, watching your outline word for word. So you can deviate from that a little bit if you need to. So there are many differences between the way we talk and the way we speak. Defining information is very important. There's also some tips about using understandable language. So I've been told that you don't want to dumb down topics. You want to almost elevate the discourse just a little bit to sound like the expert, and to challenge people and to increase their vocabulary by listening to you. But you don't want to lose them. And that's a real delicate balance of speaking and challenging people, but meeting them also where they are. You might want to avoid jargon. When you think about what this pandemic has brought us, we've had a lot of talk about what sheltering in place means, for instance, and telling people that means that you need to only go out for essential. I think that essential has become something that's been operationally defined. I mean, my husband is considered essential, so he gets to leave the house. I am not. So I get to meet you via computer. And many of you frontline workers, when you think about those of you who are checking out people who are delivering food to the curbside, bank tellers are considered essential. And so when you think about that, you need to explain, if you're going to use that word, what that word really means, because I think we've had to learn some of that. Hopefully we don't catch this virus, but if you do, then I'm sure there's going to be some medical terminology about what to deal with, that maybe you need to take acetaminophen bid. What does bid mean? Well, bid means twice a day. So that's important, maybe not so much on Tylenol, but it would definitely be important on a prescription drug that you didn't want to overdose or underdose yourself for the maximum effect in healing. So another thing that you want to work on is avoiding clutter. And I write that a lot. And I don't want to overemphasize this, because when I do that, like ums and ers and things like that, I think it takes away, and it makes you almost hyper focus on that. And then when you say it, I've even had students say, I did it again. I'm not trying to get you to do this. We're trying to be real when we speak. I want you to be authentic. I want you to be you, maybe a bit more formalized and a bit fewer cuss words if that's who you are. But verbal clutter is something that I need to really work on. I know that when I rewatch this video, I'm going to see a lot of things I know that I didn't need to say. But what that is are extraneous words. And when you say like a lot, or when you say, and that's all I have to say about that, or, and therefore, and, I've heard several good examples of verbal clutter recently. So I try to make a note of those on the rubric just so that you can have a goal of what you want to work on. Remember, when you use words, that oftentimes people need to hear them 3 times, hear new information 3 times before you get it. That's why it's good to preview, then develop in the body, and then review. Because having those items spread out throughout a 5 to 7 minute speech, it doesn't feel like you're really banging it, bam, bam, bam. But by giving them exposure 3 times, hopefully at the end, they will remember what the main points were. Why else would we be speaking, actually? So when you think about what your job is as a speaker, I like to say, in this TED Talk that I put in your unit, it elaborates more on that. But your job is to create pictures in the minds of your listeners, So you have an idea, and you want to communicate that idea so that they understand how you see that idea. It's not necessarily that they're going to agree with it or like it, but that they see how you see it. That's when we know that we have communicated. When we have a shared view, a shared vision. It doesn't necessarily have to be a shared view that you like what you hear, but that you know what that person thinks of when they use that word or when they convey that idea. I think that's really important in persuasion, because you can be a really good communicator and not have audience members change their mind. they could maybe even be more solidified in their mind. That's why I recommend going and hearing speakers who challenge your worldview, because I think if we listen to people who explain an alternative view, then that gives you more fuel for what you want to look up, what you might question about your own worldview, so that you have a stronger worldview by being able to answer some of the things that they brought up. So this chapter talks a little bit about some of the things we covered in supporting materials. It is always good to use things that are colorful. I like to say colorful language, because colorful language, again, allows people to see a very vivid picture in their mind. And when you think about a colorful language, sometimes a story can elaborate that for an audience. I think sometimes thinking win-win is a really hard concept. So when you think about it's a win-win if you stay home and yet you can still go to work, which this being broadcast to you could be technically a win-win. But I always like to use that story about the farmer and his crops, and I think I've already shared that with you, but I'll just repeat it. There was a farmer who used to win a lot of awards for his crops, and when asked how he did that by a journalist, he said, "My secret is to give my corn to my neighbors so that when my corn cross-pollinates, I get better corn." When you think that you have to keep it to yourself to be the good one, that's not really how win-win works. So by giving away my ideas and my corn, I can even prosper more. So those kind of things, having anecdotes that allow the audience to envision what you're talking about, really help. You want to avoid stereotypes. You want to avoid biased language if you can, and remember that we aren't always even aware of our biases. So it is good to practice in front of people who might call you out on those things before you give it to a larger audience and say, "Hey, reel that in. I think that you may have offended someone there." And I think that sometimes we can, we don't want to over err on the political correct side, that we lose meaning, but I think it's important that we try to be politically correct as well. So be careful with gender neutral language. It's always better. One of the things that I had to do years ago is, because I'm heterosexual and I have a spouse, but at that time homosexuals couldn't have a spouse, it was way more inclusive to just say partner, and not hard to do that. So those are the kind of things that, when we're thinking spontaneously, sometimes we revert to the way we would talk to our friends, but we need to be careful with the language choice, because once you name something, it takes on a life of its own. And so giving something a label is a really powerful thing to do. That's why it's important to say, instead of saying something like disabled people, there was a real push to put the person first. So people with different abilities is better than saying disabled people. So I hope that you find something that you can relate to in chapter 12. Remember, don't use this technological way to give your speech as a way to script your speech. You're still accountable for having an extemporaneous delivery style, which goes right down to the language choice that you use. So don't use this time at home to write your speech in paragraphs. Just as if you were going to have a live audience, you were trying to be dynamic. You were trying to pull them in with your gestures. You're trying to pull them in with your language choices. And I would say it's even more important now to use words that pluck people from your screen and allow you into their homes, allow you into their hearts and their minds, for you to challenge them with your new ideas. So be aware of your word choice without scripting your word choice. And what I think that it relies on is practice. And I say that when you practice things, vary your language. So when you practice your speech, give it a little bit differently each time that you do. And I find this to be difficult when I'm just doing this for a screen. And that's why I think it's optimal if you can, with the people that you're sheltered in place with, if you can try to practice in front of live audiences on your in your preparation journey